When I was wrapping up working on my Final Fantasy VII Remake retrospective videos, 7 Intermission had not been announced yet until I was almost done. And that's a bit unfortunate because I would have just talked about it then in those videos, but I decided, well, it's fine, I don't need to do another part, but I played the Yuffie content, and I actually felt like I had a lot to say about it for how short it was. And it just didn't really feel right to not talk about this. It is part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake experience. Why should I not talk about it? Now, 7 Remake Intergrade as an experience feels a lot more home on PlayStation 5 than it does on PlayStation 4, surprisingly enough. I mean, you not only have a 60 FPS option, but you also get better graphics, better textures, and 7 Remake certainly needed the better textures sometimes. Going on from Intergrade on PS5 to the base version on PS4 is almost like playing a multi-platform game on PlayStation 4 and then going to the Switch version. That there's something about the Switch versions of games that always seem like they extremely compromise a lot. And while they do run okay and impressive for the hardware that they're running on, that it feels like something about the experience is missing, even though everything is there, the content. Although I'm not a huge fan of every graphical upgrade on the PS5 version. Like, fog they've added everywhere into the game, especially in the VR arena. I don't like it at all. I prefer the VR arena to be much more, like, clean from a presentation aspect, because it just kind of gets in the way when you've got all this pretty looking smoke and stuff, when I just want to fight the bosses and I want to be able to see them extremely clearly, and yet you have this fog that's muddying up the image that little bit. And the load times. Oh, thank you, Square Enix, for using the power of the PS5 to its fullest extent for what could have been just a basic port. Because it makes skipping the cutscenes in the game extraordinarily easy. So for people who are not necessarily into the storyline or have already played through the story once and want to just get back into the action like me, that skipping a cutscene doesn't mean that you gotta wait like 10 to 15 seconds for the game to load and then to back into gameplay. You can just skip the cutscene and oh, there you are back into gameplay. Now let's get to the main reason why most people end up picking up this version of the game to begin with. 7 Remake Intermission, starring Yuffie and Sonon. The story of this game, despite only being 2 chapters and about 6 hours of runtime, I was actually, like, pretty invested in it. I know 7 Remake has much more going on in an average 6-hour stretch in terms of storylines than this entire DLC does. We have to consider that Intermission has to not only set up these storylines, but also follow through and then resolve it within that 6 hours, whereas 7 Remake has so many more hours of game that is supporting any of that 6-hour stretch. There's really only 2 storylines that are going on through this DLC. There is a little bit of setup, I assume, for the next part, but primarily it's just Yuffie's story arc of just sort of the way she behaves and her behavior changing throughout the course of the game until the end, and Sonon's story and all of the personal struggles that he has to deal with. I know a lot of people, right when the first trailer for Intermission came out, that they were just straight up calling that Sonon was gonna die by the end of this DLC. And I wasn't entirely sure about that, because I thought, well, maybe he could be with Yuffie at the start of the next part. Maybe he dies there as a way to kind of motivate her to join the party or something. But the moment I saw him have a flashback about his sister sacrificing herself, I was like, oh yeah, he's totally gonna die by the end of this. I don't know, there was something about it that was at least a little bit tear-jerking to me, that even despite the fact that we didn't really know that much about him, that it was a little bit moving and stuff. Although, I feel like I attribute that more to the CG cutscene right afterwards, where you see Yuffie running out of the Shinra building, crying, and then you see the plate collapse, and you just see her just emotionally collapse. That moment, I think, got to me much more and made me feel much more bad about his sacrifice than the actual moment did. I will say, though, that Yuffie's story side of just seeing her, I don't know, it didn't feel quite as strong. Maybe it just had to do with kind of a lot of the anime-esque moments. The way I feel about that is, I feel like this is an extended introduction to Yuffie as a character, and kind of the same way that Base 7 Remake was an extended introduction to basically everybody in the 7 universe. You know what I mean? That the characters do change and evolve throughout the course of 7 Remake. But we're barely dipping our toes in with what these characters are going to go through and how they'll change compared to what's going to happen later. And so, for Yuffie, a character who is entirely optional in the original game, and you didn't really learn that much about her unless you were doing some optional Wutai stuff much later, then yeah, this actually feels like a pretty decent introduction to her. I actually appreciate the DLC's chapters particularly because while it is clearly reusing assets from the main game and stuff like that, it does it in a way that feels smart and actually kind of pleases the fans a little bit, because Chapter 1 is just Chapter 3 from the main game, but a lot of people really wanted to go back to Sector 7 after they played Chapter 3, even though within the story it would have been impossible and made no sense really in the timeline to just have you go back to that same place again and do all those fetch quests and stuff. So having Yuffie go and do that stuff like gives us the opportunity to go back and fulfill that desire. And Chapter 2 is just Chapter 17 from the main game where you're going through all those labs and stuff, but now it has like a militaristic weapon vibe to it instead of the weird biospecimen lab experiment vibe that Hojo's lab did. But there is like a weird aspect of the recycling I'm not a big fan of, which is how they recycle a lot of the thematics from the main game into this DLC, which they didn't have to. Like how both in the main game and in Intermission, towards the end of the first chapter, you fight a insect-inspired robot boss that can climb on the walls to evade your attacks. Or how you end up fighting a gross Lovecraftian-esque monster in a location, but actually that location's not the location you're actually in, it's being disguised somehow. Or a mysterious blood trail that you end up following to run into the guy who will end up being the final boss that you fight. And that also brings me to Deep Ground with Nero as the final boss and then Weiss as the super boss. And it's interesting how this DLC, as well as the main game, deliberately decide to not explain what the deal with any of these guys are. It seems to me, the fact that they did it a second time, seems to me like it's a deliberate choice that they're not going to explain who these guys are, rather than it just being a weird issue of like, oh, well, they ran out of time, they didn't have any, like, budget or anything. As for gameplay, it's 7 Remake. Yuffie, as an individual character, has much more going on than any of the individual characters from the 7 Remake base game, but also there's less going on in general when it comes to gameplay because it's just Yuffie and then an AI-controlled character. You don't even have a full party this time. Yuffie's a pretty fun character to play as. I mean, not just in terms of just having more moves to play with compared to your average 7R character, but she feels much more well-rounded to use. That it doesn't feel like if I'm not playing with Sonon that I'm missing out on like almost everything else I'm capable of compared to doing some of the solo missions with Cloud or Barrett or something like that. That, oh, I feel like I'm missing like the vast majority of my tool set by just playing this one character. I actually feel like the game's pretty good at getting you to understand Yuffie's gameplay fully, or at least fully enough for a normal mode playthrough, by the end of Intermission. That throws enough enemy variety at you and enough interesting situations that you really understand Yuffie's kit very comprehensively by the end of Intermission. Whereas I feel with 7 Remake, that you might not necessarily understand what every character does by the end of a normal mode playthrough of the normal game. Granted, you only play as Yuffie during Intermission, so basically every fight is a Yuffie fight, so it's not like you have to switch between characters, and so you have that aspect to deal with. So I understand why Yuffie's easier to learn, because you inherently just spend more time with her in her DLC. I do feel like it's a little bit unfortunate though, because that is just her and AI Sonon. I really would have loved to have seen her just fight more of the bosses from the main game, or even maybe, I don't know how you would do this, but let her join the main party somehow. Because she does have some pretty cool, interesting skills. I'd love to see how that would interact with all the other party member dynamics and gimmicks that they have going on and whatnot. But I guess that's what the sequel's for, isn't it? And then there's the brand new ending cutscene for 7 Remake. And I thought it was just gonna be 30 seconds of like a shot of calm and then rack focus to the characters, and you see the characters go off to calm. Like, we know what they're gonna end up doing, and it's a tease for the next game. But it's actually a multi-minute CG cutscene that's in line with the CG cutscenes of the main game. It almost feels like a linking between Part 1 and Part 2, that if you had never played 7R before, you started playing when Part 2 came out, you started Part 1, this would fully transition you into Part 2 once you beat Intermission. Man, I can't believe they walked from Midgar to Calm and they didn't have any random encounters whatsoever. And that's BS, because I try to walk from Midgar to Calm, and I always at least have like 1 or 2 when I could do that. Come on. However, the most interesting part of his new ending is the Zack section, because it gives you a lot of speculation material about the next part. Ooh. Oh yeah, I forgot to talk about Zack in my last part of the 7 Remake Retrospective. The main reason I decided not to was because I just really think that there was anything interesting or relevant about those scenes. It's way too vague to speculate on or to try to really get anything from. It just felt detached from pretty much everything else. But this ending does give you like some more concrete stuff to go off of. It's implied in this ending that whatever timeline Zack is in, that Aerith is either missing or even dead by the time Zack gets back to Midgar. So combine that with the different looking stamp chip bag from the original game's ending, and how the church looks just different enough in this new ending that, yeah, this is an alternate timeline. Now, I'm gonna take this alternate timeline idea one step further than that. Now, one of the big complaints about the game's story is the reveal that Biggs and potentially even Jesse are alive despite the plate collapsing. That it undermines a lot of the drama of them sacrificing themselves to stop the plate from collapsing, and just all of this mass tragedy, and what motivates the characters to take on Shinra, that if they end up alive anyways. And I do agree with that, but what if Biggs and Jesse are alive in this alternate timeline that Zack is also alive in? Now, I'm gonna make probably the most wild narrative prediction that I have made in this Remake video series so far. That I'm either gonna be extremely completely off or nail it right in the head. There's no in between. I predict that the reason why Zack's alternate timeline exists, that Zack ends up living and all of these other characters end up living, and then presumably the main cast is dead or captured or something, that it's going to be revealed that this is the first attempt, or one of the first attempts, of Sephiroth trying to travel back in time to change the outcome in his favor. Now, it makes sense from our perspective as an audience that Sephiroth would travel back to the beginning of FF7 Midgar, because, well, that's where the original game started. That's where our journey started with these characters. But if you look in-universe, in the timeline, Sephiroth could have gone to whenever he wanted to. Unless there's some weird rule in the 7 universe about how far back in time you can time travel, Sephiroth could have gone to Crisis Core era, he could have gone back to his own childhood to change things. So it makes me wonder if this Zack timeline might be Sephiroth traveling back to maybe the Crisis Core period to try to change things. But maybe he went back too far, and then something about it caused the main party to not form, and Sephiroth needs the main party to form for some reason in order to end up subverting them for his plan. And so that attempt is Zack's timeline. So yeah, I think that's it for this series, because I've pretty much covered everything that's available for playable 7 Remake content. Notice I said playable, because I'm not covering that one book about Aerith and Tifa. No, I'm not doing that. So anyways, guys, that's it for the video, and have a good day.